Welcome back. Several calls purposely reporting false mass shootings have sparked conversation on the issue of what many are calling swatting. Eventually, these false mass shootings are identified as a hoax, but the psychological effect it can have on those involved has very real consequences. Joining me to discuss this concern is Professor of Psychology and Urban Studies at Fordham University, Harold Takooshian. Harold, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Kibin.
Now, can you just let
Can I
everybody
mention
know
something quick that may interest you?
Sure.
Back in 1971, I was in class with Merle Hoffman. I haven't seen her in 50 years.
Oh, wow, that's pretty amazing. It's such a small world. Thank you so much for sharing that.
And she was very passionate at that time, and she still is.
Oh, that's
Thank you, Kibin.
awesome. Now, I
Yep.
want to talk a little bit. I'm glad to have you here. I want to talk about what swatting is because this is actually the first time that I've heard this term. So, can you explain what that is?
Yes. And I'll explain that one of the courses I teach for the past 40 years is law and psychology. So swatting is relevant to that. Swatting is when pranksters or people with bad intent contact the authorities, usually the local police, with a fictitious false report that something illegal is happening, and the SWAT team goes to the site. And unfortunately, this often results in violence because the SWAT team is on edge, and they may hurt innocent people by misunderstanding what's happening. I don't know, Kibin, if you're asking about this because of any cases in the Bronx, but it is a national problem.
Now, what happens, like you kind of let us know a little bit, but what happens when a school is threatened with this type of alarm, and then they eventually later realize that it was a hoax?
Well, initially, when we didn't know what swatting was, the authorities, the SWAT teams, would go out immediately. They didn't want to lose time investigating the details. But now we know that swatting occurs so that the SWAT teams are more circumspect. They check before they go. That is, they make sure that the report they're getting is true, not false. So it's fair to say that today swatting, we have a remedy for swatting, namely to verify the information before acting on it. But if we don't verify the information, swatting could be really tragic for schools.
Now, what are some of the reasons people actually make these fake calls? For me, it's hard to understand why somebody would even do that, considering, the state our country is in right now. So, can you just give us a little bit of insight on that?
Yes, two things. One is that you and Rebecca and your station are very ahead of the curve because swatting is still a relatively unknown phenomenon. We don't know that much about it. And the work is being done by journalists more than law enforcement. The journalists are the one connecting the dots. And the second thing is that there are very few legal remedies right now. I could talk about that if you like. But the fact is that in law and psychology, in the course I teach, we don't even mention swatting. It's what stalking was 25 years ago, a crime without a name. 25 years ago, people said, oh, stalking, you're following somebody. Well, it's not a crime until there's actual violence. Well, now we know better. There are anti-stalking laws. Right now, there are no anti-swatting laws. In fact, I could talk about the legal aspects of it. It seems like swatting is a hard crime to prosecute. People who do this are, I would call them mostly evil people, not just pranksters, but people who really want to create harm. And unfortunately, there are very few laws to protect us from these people.
Now, I would actually like to kind of talk about the laws. Now, I was under the impression that Senator Schumer at least had a plan to kind of mitigate this. I want to hear your thoughts on that. I see that you're reacting. Can you tell me your thoughts on that?
Senator Schumer always has a plan on Sunday afternoon, but I don't know of his effort. The fact is that it's hard to do this on a national level because these laws are usually local. That's the problem. There was one case that finally made it to the Supreme Court, back in 2015, Anthony Alonis. And the court, well, Anthony Alonis was prosecuted for cyberbullying and against his divorcing wife. And the Supreme Court, on a federal level, actually rejected the conviction. In other words, they sent it back to the lower court with an 8-1 majority. Justice Scalia and Ginsburg agreed that it's hard to prosecute people for cyberbullying. You have to prove they have a guilty mind, mens rea. So I would say that working at a federal level is very hard. It's hard to regulate swatting because of the it's still an unclear crime. Let me say it that way.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about the psychological effect that it could have on the people in the schools. Now, what I guess to see just a
Yeah.
SWAT team, I could imagine is a very scary thing for a teacher, a student. Could you just talk about the effect that will have on somebody's mind to just even see that?
Yes. I think the reason why we're so upset with swatting, what makes it especially evil, is that the very same people, the police officers there to protect us, are the ones who are threatening us. They're coming with a false report, and they may harm innocent civilians rather than protecting them. So the impact on schools of this crime of swatting is that it reverses the tables, and innocent people become the targets of the SWAT team. There are a few cases around the country that are really tragic where this has occurred. But fortunately, because of shows like yours, people are aware of swatting and they know that it could be stopped before it happens. But the impact on local schools, if it's successful, can be devastating.
Now, how could this threat be affecting a student's capability to learn or a teacher's ability to educate under very stressful circumstances?
Well, it just adds to the as you imply, it adds to the stress level, because when we see police coming through the door, we want to assume that they're there to protect us. But if they're getting false reports, of course, the stress level escalates when we realize that they may not be there for the proper reason. I would note that there's one journalist, Hal Bergall, who's done an excellent job of describing the different kinds of swatting. It might be helpful if I share these with your listeners.
Yes, of course.
Just briefly, Bergall notes that swatting now, because it's hard to prosecute, has been increasing. There's celebrity swatting, when people, as pranks, try to shake up celebrity figures. Then there's gamer swatting. It's almost like a game among hackers on the internet to see if they can create problems without getting caught. Then there's ideological swatting, people on the left or right trying to punish their adversaries. Then there's what we might call hate swatting, people who are racist or sexist who are using swatting to target those that they don't like. In other words, swatting is hard to prosecute, and all kinds of people are using it to their own advantage. And as you say, Kibin, the targeting of schools is especially evil because the children are so at risk and so vulnerable.
Right. Now, I want to know what are some ways that, well, first, do you think this type of hoax could desensitize our schools or, people who are responding if they get, so many fake calls, is it eventually going to be a situation where like, oh, it may be, fake or something? Do you think we're at risk of being desensitized to something like that?
You're right on target, Kibin. It's important to punish people, even if there is no violence, even if it results in no harm. Unfortunately, the way the internet is structured now, people could make calls anonymously that can't be traced. And when that happens, the police have a hard time prosecuting. But I agree with you 100% that we should not become jaded to these calls because every once in a while, one of them may be real. It's really up to the lawyers among us on the state level, not the federal level, not Chuck Schumer, but on the state level, to come up with effective legislation to reduce this crime so that we don't get used to hearing these false reports.
And what do you think people can do? I'm sure that the more people learn about this, the more that they are going to be upset that something like this is, happening. What can people do to ensure that their voice is being heard and that, elected officials are kind of taking this a little bit more seriously or putting this toward the forefront?
You're asking the right question. I would say what you're doing right now is what should be done. I don't know if individuals could help, but the media, like your program, exposing this problem. As I say, in my law and psychology course, none of our textbooks even mention swatting. It really is important to recognize the crime before we try to address it.
And my last question, I want to talk about just what can people do? I mean, I guess parents or, people who are around those who've been affected by swatting, what can they do to support them emotionally and mentally?
The parents of the children.
Hmm.
I would say we have a wonderful trend right now in the U.S. where parents are becoming more involved in their children's education. And this is part of it, to find ways to identify what is stressing our children and to reduce it. The sad thing about childhood stress is that often children have stresses that we're not aware of.
Right.
We really have to listen carefully and make sure that we're answering their needs. So I would say parents being involved in their school, that's the main thing. And we have that now, I think.
All right. Well, Harold, thank you so much for joining me and having this discussion.
Thank you, Kibin. I appreciate it.
Stay tuned. We have more open for you right after this.